Alrighty, so you just did your bell ringer. Let's get into our guided notes. What are we talking about today? Today, I can map various types of natural hazards to determine their impact on society. Ooh, kind of scary, so let's get into it. So first off, what even is a natural hazard? What are we talking about? So natural hazards are those threats of naturally occurring events that may have a negative impact on humans. So this is our earthquakes, our volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, tornadoes, any of those scary things that happen naturally or scary types of weather. That's your natural hazard. So technically these natural hazards are always around, always able to come up. But when they actually happen, when we actually get that hurricane or actually have an earthquake happen, that is when we call it a natural disaster. If that hazard actually harms people, causes us to lose lives, sadly, or your property is damaged or hurts the environment, that is when it's called a natural disaster, when those humans are actually hurt. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to go down through, it looks like a lot, but every slide's going to be relatively short, so don't freak out, okay? We're going to go through a bunch of different types of natural hazards. We're going to talk about where they happen and what impacts they have on human lives. So what is the problem with these natural hazards occurring? And we're going to start with those earthquakes. So first, where do earthquakes occur? Earthquakes occur at plate boundaries or those fault lines. So we talked about this briefly when we talked about those plate boundaries. Anywhere where those plates move past each other is going to cause an earthquake. So basically those plates, when they move, it causes some friction, and as you can see here, them moving past each other causes the land to actually shake. So the earth is quaking. Pretty cool. So obviously we don't have a ton of earthquakes around here because we're not really close to a fault line. But if you look over here in California, they are like right on a plate boundary. So they get big earthquakes like all the time, okay? All the time. So what is the impact? You can lose your life if you're in a big enough earthquake. Most earthquakes are really small, so not much happens. But if it's a really big one, just things falling around you could cause the loss of human life. And definitely the biggest thing is the shaking of the earth can cause like buildings and structures to collapse. So it can cost some money to rebuild some stuff, all right? One thing I want to mention, because this comes up a lot, there is a we call it the Ring of Fire. I don't know why they had to give it such a scary name, but the Ring of Fire, if you look here on this map of the Earth, this is North America, so we're over here, and we're used to seeing North America over here, so this is kind of messing with your brain a little bit probably, but over here is Asia, so that's where like China and Japan is. So around this part of the Pacific Ocean is a big boundary, and because that boundary lines up beautifully right there, there's a lot of earthquakes that happen right here in that Ring of Fire. So the Ring of Fire has a lot of earthquakes, but they also have a lot of volcanoes. So that's going to be our second one. So volcanoes, when they erupt, they can cause some damage. So where do these occur? Again, we talked about this before, but we're going to talk about it again. Volcanoes love to pop up in those subduction zones. So that is when you have an oceanic crust and a continental crust, or it can be two oceanic plates. One of them just has to be underneath the ocean. They converge or collide, they come together, and we know they're colliding because look at those arrows. And then the more dense or the heavier crust is going to sink under the other, pushing up that magma to form a volcano. So that is what's happening at the subduction zone. So whenever a volcano actually erupts, lots of things can happen. It can burn up a lot of plant or animal life. There's a lot of ash in the air because it's very smoky, and that can make it hard to breathe. And of course, loss of life, destruction of property. It can burn stuff up. And again, like I said, that Ring of Fire, this makes more sense for the Ring of Fire because there's literally fire in this ring. Kind of terrifying. This is where a lot of volcanoes are and erupt as well. So yeah. volcanoes. And I wanted to slide this one in here because when we think of volcanoes, I think we typically think of one looking like this, but they can look like all kinds of weird, crazy stuff, okay? Like this volcano right here, I think is gorgeous. Look at her shine. This is the Yellowstone volcano. So this volcano is in the Yellowstone National Park, which maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't heard of, but it's over here. So like we're down here, here's Mississippi. It's all the way over here. Now this volcano, I don't want to scare you, this volcano is kind of overdue to erupt, and we're going to talk about this later, but you can kind of predict when a volcano might erupt. It's kind of overdue, so it should have erupted by now, but if it does erupt, the red here is where you're going to see significant loss, so there's going to be lava everywhere. In this orange part, there's going to be a lot of hot ash, so still some stuff burned up. And in the yellow part here, which notice we're in it, it's going to be literally raining ash, so raining burnt up material. That's how big this volcanic eruption can be. So hopefully within our lifetime, that Yellowstone volcano doesn't erupt, because I don't know about y'all, but I don't really want to have to stay indoors because it's raining ash. That sounds like a 2020 type of thing, but knock on wood, I hope it doesn't happen. Okay, so another natural hazard that can occur is flooding. So where is flooding going to happen? Obviously near rivers or waterways. Not waterways where there is a lot of water. Duh. Or along coastlines. So a coastline is just meaning you're on the coast, so you're near the ocean. So states over here, we're kind of technically on a coastline because down here the Gulf of Mexico connects into the ocean, so we're near large bodies of water. So that's a coastline. Or anywhere where there's a lot of storms. So if it rains a ton, it can add up a lot of water, causing some flood. So what's the problem with floods? Is you can have a major loss of property. So if your house floods, it can do a lot of damage. And also you can drown in a flood. That's less likely to happen, but it can ruin some farmland too. So if you've got a big field full of crops and it floods, it can kill all those crops, and that's how you make your money. So that's not a good thing. Flooding, we actually had a big flood, you may or may not remember, in Jackson last year, like right before COVID hit, so maybe it was on your radar still, but it was like February-ish, March maybe. Jackson flooded a ton because the river it's close to just really, it rained a ton and it couldn't take it. So you can see there's a lot of water in the streets. So you can imagine that causes some property damage. Next thing is tornadoes. So where do tornadoes happen? And in this case, I'm talking about like the big tornadoes, like the swirly ones that actually come down and touch the ground. So these are more typical in the middle of the United States here because it's super flat. We actually call that Tornado Alley. Makes sense. It's where you get your tornadoes. And like I said, it's super flat. So anytime you have a tornado like this, it is more likely to actually swirl and hit the ground if there aren't any hills or mountains around. And that's the case for the middle of the United States. So this is a perfect spot for a tornado to just hit the ground. So they can technically happen anywhere, but they are more likely over here because it's super flat. Impact, again, loss of life. You'll notice that is a trend. That can actually cause flooding to happen because typically, I know this is a lot of wind, but it brings on a lot of rain as well, and that thing can really destroy some property. If there's a tornado that comes through your house, say goodbye to your house because those things are strong. So yeah, tornadoes. Next, we have our hurricanes, okay? So where do hurricanes happen? Typically in warm tropical ocean waters near a coastline. Now when I say tropical, I'm actually going to pull back up the map again. If something is called like tropical, you've probably heard of like a tropical island, or you think of Hawaii as being tropical. It's tropical if it's along the ocean and it's closer toward the equator or the center of the earth. So it's nice and warm, okay? So think warm ocean locations. That's where your tropical ocean waters are. So, and again, near coastline, so near the ocean. So there's a major impact of hurricanes. You can obviously have a lot of rain and stormage come through. flooding because, again, that's a lot of water that gets swirled up with the hurricane, and those winds and waters are so strong and are moving so quickly that when it hits buildings, it really destroys the property, like pretty badly. So I'm sure you guys have heard of Hurricane Katrina. You were super little when it happened, but if you were alive, oh my gosh, when were you guys born? Anyway, ooh, scary to think about. But Hurricane Katrina was like such a big deal. It was massive. And most people talk about it hitting New Orleans because that's where it definitely hit the most. But a lot of Mississippi was damaged through it as well. So down here in Gulfport, which again is right along the water, right down here. So it got hit the hardest out of everywhere in the state, of course, because it was right there. A lot of damage happened, a lot of damage. So we'll actually watch a video of that tomorrow because it's scary to think about, but it's kind of cool to see how strong the winds can be. So yeah, hurricanes, watch out for those. All right, next is forest fires. So we don't really worry about that happening down here as much, but they do occur. So a forest fire is just where the fire is literally, or the forest is literally on fire. That's terrifying. So where does this happen? How do forests just randomly burst into flames? So typically these are going to happen in areas that are super dry and they don't receive much rain. Okay, because anytime it rains, that water cools off any of the heat. So this wood in the forest, once it gets super dry, it's going to be a lot more flammable, meaning it's more easily able to catch on fire. So when it gets super hot, they just kind of burn up. And when one tree starts burning up, it spreads to another tree and another tree until suddenly you have a massive fire happening. You may remember at the beginning of 2020 again, 2020 is such a fun year, clearly. Australia, a lot of Australia was burning up. They had a ton of forest fires happening throughout the whole country, really, at the beginning of 2020. And also California, which I think we've all heard of California, but if you don't know, California is right over here. They have a similar climate, meaning similar weather, so they also had a ton of forest fires. And I actually have a friend who moved to California, and I went to visit her a few months ago, and the fires were pretty much done, but this is literally what it looked like. If you were driving along the street next to, like, where there's not a lot of town, if that makes sense, so it's mostly just wooded areas, it's all burned up. Like, it burned all the way up to the road, so kind of scary. Obviously, if you have a house near a forest fire, you're going to lose your house. It can catch on fire. People are mostly not harmed by forest fires, which is nice, but however, all the animals and stuff in the forest, they move somewhere else or they get caught up in the fire. I'm sorry, that's so sad to say, but they definitely lose their habitat. So their little rabbit or deer or whatever home is probably gone because it got burned up. But we don't have a lot of forest fires here because we get some rain. It's not nearly as dry or hot. So don't worry about any woods in Sardis catching on fire. I think we're safe. Okay, so next we have tsunamis. I think this one's pretty cool. You may have heard of a tsunami before, maybe not. They're pretty rare, so I wouldn't be surprised if you said you haven't really heard of them. But they're basically when an earthquake happens underwater in the ocean. And if that earthquake is big enough, it can cause a massive wave to crash up onto the shore. So tsunamis are going to happen on land near the ocean. Makes sense. So an earthquake can happen in the ocean anywhere, but if it's like out in the middle of the ocean, like not near any land, it's not really going to be that big of a deal. It's just going to be a big, massive wave, right? But if it's happening near land and it crashes onto the shore, that's when it's a problem. That's when you can get that loss of life. I mean, look at this right here. If you're standing right there, oh boy, good luck to you. Destruction of property, obviously have a lot of property being destroyed. Like this guy's really like, oh crap, gotta turn around, gotta go, because look at all these buildings being literally swept away. And obviously flooding, that's a lot of water. So like I said, they're pretty rare. Here's a tsunami that happened in Japan in 2011, so 10 years ago. And yeah, we don't get a ton of them because it has to be a big enough earthquake and it has to be near land. Like there's a lot of things that have to perfectly come together for a tsunami to happen. Okay, last one, we've got landslides, or you might hear them called mudslides. So this is exactly how it sounds like. The land is sliding. So this is what's going to happen on mountains that are on sloped land, or just anything that receives a lot of rain and also wind. So basically when the hill gets too steep, gravity can eventually cause those rocks to just eventually be weighed down and slide all the way down. So these happen usually not this big. Usually it's just a couple of rocks that fall, but if there's a lot of buildup, it can all fall at once, and that's when it's no good. So obviously anything in its path it's going to totally take out, and that's a lot of mess left over. So that's a lot of debris. That's what that word is. Debris that you have to clean up. Like you can't drive down that street anymore, so you got to clean it up, right? So these happen again anywhere with a lot of steep hills. I've been driving down a road, especially one near a lot of hillside, and you see this sign that says falling rock. That's what it's for. It's for any potential landslides or that rock being falling down because of all that gravity pushing on it. Okay, we just covered a lot of ground today, a lot of natural hazards. We're going to practice this a bunch tomorrow, but you guys have got this. But if you have any questions, hit me up, please.